This is not an exaggeration. We have just witnessed one of the greatest races in triathlon history. The 2023 PTO European Open has been one of, if not the most hyped triathlon race of all time. The PTO is a new race organiser in the triathlon world, having had their first official year of races in 2022, where they put up $1 million worth of prize money for each of their races. This meant that they attracted the world's best triathletes and had invite-only fields where only the world's top-ranked triathletes got invitations. And the races delivered. They were raced by the best, won by the best, and involved some of the most epic races the long-course triathlon world had ever seen. And so that brings us to 2023, and the first PTO race of the year, the PTO European Open. Because of the long gap of 7 months between the last PTO race and this one, the triathlon world's excitement grew and grew until, in my opinion, the PTO European Open had become arguably the most talked about and most anticipated race of all time. Both the men's and women's races, by the way. But for today's video, due to how the races played out, we will be focusing on the men's race. The men's race was so big because of the field assembled. It was truly unlike any other field long course triathlon had ever seen. It had so many storylines that it would be hard to fit them all in. But firstly, it was the long anticipated return race of the man most people consider the greatest of all time, Jan Frodeno. Jan's an Olympic gold medalist and 3-time Ironman world champion, and has basically been unbeatable for his entire long course career. Olympic gold is likely the hardest race to win in triathlon. Jan won it in 2008, and one of the most special things about this race was that we had all of the subsequent gold medal winners from 2012, 2016 and 2021 in this race in the form of Alistair Brownlee and Kristian Blummenfelt. Those who don't consider Jan Frodeno the GOAT most likely don't because they consider Alistair Brownlee to be just that. Alistair is the only 2-time Olympic champion in triathlon history. And the man who many think will eventually overtake both of them as the GOAT is Kristian Blummenfelt. And so the big question was, would Kristian have been as successful as he was last year if Jan Frodeno had been racing? Or was he only able to dominate the way he did because Jan wasn't there? This was the biggest question people wanted answered from today's race. So that question, plus Alistair being in the race, is probably enough to make a case for this being the most stacked long course triathlon field of all time. But there's more. Outside of these 3 men, we had almost all of the world's best triathletes over this distance in the race. The rising star Magnus Ditlev, known for being the best cyclist in world triathlon, as well as Leon Chevalier, Florian Angert, Frederick Funk, Aaron Royal, Daniel Bakkegaard, Jason West, Kyle Smith, and many others. In fact, the only thing that could have made this field crazier was if it had Kristian's teammate and the best over this distance we've ever seen, Gustav Iden, and last year's rising star, Sam Laidlow, in it. Oh, and there's one other name I've left out. The man who this entire story ends up being about. Max Neumann. Coming into the race, the question to start the day was, could Kristian Blummenfelt stay with the leaders in the swim? He's known as the best runner in the field, and so for his rivals, they don't want to be anywhere near him coming into T2 off the bike and onto the run. And while still being a great swimmer, he can occasionally get gapped in the water if the best swimmers decide to really hammer. And today, they hammered. Aaron Royal was the man who did most of the work, and he took with him a group of 10 out of the water, including Jan Frodeno, Alistair Brownlee, Kyle Smith, and Max Neumann, with a 1 minute 10-second lead to the chase pack, which, most notably, was where Kristian Blummenfelt was positioned. Magnus Ditlev, the best cyclist in the field and world ranked number 3, was a further 20 seconds behind Blummenfelt out of the water. Early into the bike, the lead group out of the water started riding hard, trying to push their advantage. They started dropping members of the group, and after only 12 kilometres were down to 7 men and had extended their advantage to Kristian Blummenfelt, who was now 1 minute 35 seconds down. Magnus Ditlev had gained back the time he'd lost in the swim to Blummenfelt and was sitting right behind him. And this is when things got really interesting. Because for the next 20 kilometres, Magnus Ditlev went extraterrestrial and started riding power numbers that I'd love to know, but I can only assume were at least 480 watts. And everyone around him was unable to hold his wheel as he made his way from the chase pack to the front of the race, except for Kristian Blummenfelt. Kristian held on. And because of this, after 35 kilometres of the bike, we found ourselves in a position where both Magnus and Kristian had bridged the 90-second gap to the front of the race, and suddenly we were back to 9 at the front. And this is when we saw Max Neumann really show himself in the race. Where we had all expected Magnus to go straight to the front of the group and try to break the race open, we saw Max. Max went to the front, and he stayed there, accompanied by Alistair Brownlee and Kyle Smith. And then suddenly, the three of them had a 15-second gap to the rest of the group, including Jan Frodeno, Kristian Blummenfelt, and Magnus Ditlev. And after 10 kilometres of chasing, Magnus finally got back to the front, but the surge he put in to do so saw Kristian Blummenfelt and Jan Frodeno either unable to hold his wheel or make a brave tactical decision to not hold it and get gapped. And so now we had a lead group of 4, Max Neumann, Alistair Brownlee, Kyle Smith, and Magnus Ditlev. And it would stay like that until the end of the bike, except the gap to the rest would grow. And it grew a lot. By the time they hit T2 to start running, the gap to Jan and Kristian was 1 minute. And for most fields, only having a 1 minute gap over those two would just not be enough to hold them back. But like I said, this PTO European Open field was not just any other field. Early on the run, Alistair Brownlee went to the front, pushing hard like he always has and most likely always will do. Kyle Smith went with him, surprisingly, but not for long. And after 5 kilometres of running, at about 3 minute per K pace might I add, Alistair Brownlee had opened up a 30-second gap to Kyle Smith and Max Neumann in second and third. Magnus was a further 20 seconds back, and the gap to Kristian and Jan had grown even more to 1 minute 30 and 1 minute 40 respectively. Alistair Brownlee, when at the peak of his powers, was known for racing aggressively and being the best 10-kilometre runner the sport of triathlon has ever and maybe will ever see. And he was showing that today. Alistair has, however, never quite been able to hold on over these run distances closer to the half marathon. And this is something that so many triathlon fans find intriguing to watch. Will today be the day Alistair does it? And so in that moment, only triathlon fans will really understand just how exciting it was to watch Alistair Brownlee at the front of this race. We wouldn't have to wait long to find out though, as between kilometre 5 and 8, 2 things happened. 1, Alistair slowed down. And 2, Max Neumann got faster. Max dropped Kyle Smith and by the 8 kilometre mark had caught Alistair Brownlee. Behind them, Magnus Ditlev was in third, 30 seconds back. Kyle Smith in fourth, a further 10 seconds. And the big story was that Kristian Blummenfelt had dropped Jan Frodeno, something that no one had really done in the better part of a decade, and Kristian was the fastest runner of all of the contenders. He was 53 seconds back from Max and Alistair and 30 seconds ahead of Jan. And so here we had it, 10 kilometres to go in one of the most entertaining and action-packed races the triathlon world had ever seen. Alistair Brownlee and Max Neumann in front, the young gun Magnus Ditlev in third, and the heir apparent to GOAT status, Kristian Blummenfelt, dropping the current GOAT Jan Frodeno in 5th and 6th. At this point, it became obvious that Jan Frodeno was not going to win. Something that many thought may happen, but not many dared to say out loud. And to be honest, watching it happen seems strange. It has just become so foreign to see Jan Frodeno do anything other than win. But long course triathlon has changed over the past 2 to 3 years and gone to a new level, and that's what we were seeing today. Alistair tried to hold on to Max, but he just couldn't. And by 10 kilometres in, Max had established himself in the lead by 20 seconds. Kristian Blummenfelt was continuing to run faster than everyone else around him and ran up beside and then straight around Magnus Ditlev and a fading Alistair Brownlee. He was now only 41 seconds behind Max Neumann, and this was the battle for first and second. Jan Frodeno was now 1 minute back, and the big mover through the field was Jason West. He was running incredibly fast behind, but was too far back at 2 minutes and 40 seconds down. Magnus Ditlev was looking solid, but was just not running to the same level as Max and Kristian, so it became obvious that he would finish third. And he did end up finishing third for the record. But, like I said, the entire focus of the triathlon world was on Max Neumann and Kristian Blummenfelt. They were both, to the naked eye, absolutely destroying themselves to try and win this race. By 15 kilometres in, Kristian brought the gap from 41 seconds down to Max, now only to 31 seconds down to Max. 3 kilometres to go. Kristian looked to be running faster and Max hurting, and by 16.5 kilometres in, Kristian was now only 19 seconds down to Max. 19 seconds down with 1.5 kilometres remaining. Max looked like he was going to the absolute depths of despair to hold off one of the best runners in the sport in Kristian Blummenfelt. This was, however, not the first battle these two had had. At the Ironman World Championships last year, they came third and fourth, with Kristian just getting the better of Max, except that day the roles were reversed, and in the back end of the marathon, it was Max hunting Kristian and kilometre by kilometre closing the gap to him. And so to see this battle picked up where it left off, in both men's next race against each other, was special. A lot of people looked at Max Neumann's performance to finish fourth at the Ironman World Championships as a performance that came from nowhere, and they saw Kristian as the established world beater. And so it seemed like Max would fight and dig deep, but the proven running class of Kristian would get him the victory as he closed the gap to Max. But then the craziest thing all day happened. With 1 kilometre to go, the gap that had been falling stopped, and Max found another gear. He was now running the same speed as Kristian, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, he was sprinting for the line and running faster than Kristian. And the look of sheer pain that was on his face turned into something else. A look of elation, maybe anger, maybe rage, or excitement, or all of those in one. I don't really know what that look was, but it must be hard to know the depths of emotion felt by a human who had just fought like his life had depended on it and had done it. Max Neumann crossed the line, victorious, in the biggest race win of his career. Kristian Blummenfelt came in 27 seconds back from Max in second, and like we talked about earlier, Magnus Ditlev was third, 1 minute 50 seconds down. Jan Frodeno, the GOAT, was fourth in the end. Jason West, who we saw run through the field, was fifth, and Alistair Brownlee, after a brave fight all day, just like we've come to expect from Alistair, was sixth. All of the talk in the lead up to this race had been about the big three: Kristian Blummenfelt, Jan Frodeno, and Alistair Brownlee. And then some of the younger crew, like Magnus Ditlev, had their fair share. But in the end, it was the forgotten man, the quiet, humble, hardworking Australian, coached by his younger brother in relative anonymity, Max Neumann, who had stolen the show. It should not have been a surprise to anyone. Max finished the year in 2022, ranked number 4 in the world, and had shown he was one of the best. And yet, the triathlon community had barely spoken of him in the build-up to the most hyped race the triathlon world had ever seen. Max Neumann, take a bow. You are the PTO European Open champion.